with its mighty pharaohs, multiple gods, and magnificent art. It's easy to think that ancient Egypt was always powerful and successful. But there were also darker times: conflict, civil war, famine, and an overall feeling of catastrophe. And the only way it could survive was through its own resilience and the strongest of leadership. Now this is Sesostris III, who ruled Egypt almost 4,000 years ago. He's strong and he's muscular, everything a pharaoh should be. And yet look at his face. His scowling features have been interpreted to suggest his harsh rule and his large ears, his ability to hear any plots against him. Sesostris embodies the way Egypt's monarchs ruled during its turbulent times. This king controlled his enemies through a series of military fortresses and through magical curses. For this is a new era in Egypt's history, not only ruled by military power, but by fear and suspicion. And Egypt's darkest times threatened to destroy its entire civilization. I've already explored how Egypt's ancient culture began thousands of years earlier. Blessed by the River Nile and a rich natural environment, and a society united by a complex ideology. But in this episode, we'll see how the massive self-confidence of the Pyramid Age was not to last, as a dark age brought this civilization to the brink of annihilation. Make no mistake, this is the home of the dead, and we're in amongst them. These were times of famine, civil war, and anarchy. Kings have been reduced to something on a minuscule level. But this collapse triggered one of the greatest revivals of ancient times, with Egypt re-emerging more powerful and wealthy than ever before. Welcome to my story of ancient Egypt. Saqqara, where Egypt's great Pyramid Age began. But among its glories, there's also evidence of a far less well-known side to Egypt's story. Its descent into a dark age. The zenith of Egypt's Old Kingdom was the Great Pyramid at Giza, and only 200 years later, King Unas Causeway was created. It might not look much today, but it's the highlight of Unas Pyramid Complex, a 750-metre-long causeway which symbolically connected life and death. It goes right from the Nile Valley all the way up onto the high desert plateau, right to the foot of the Pyramid of Unas. So it would have been used for his funeral procession, but it would also have drawn up that life-giving force from the valley below up to the city of the dead here at Saqqara. A narrow slit in the roof once allowed enough lighting, but the extraordinary thing is that this causeway was designed for a sole purpose: the king's funeral procession. Carved upon its walls are scenes revealing both sides of life, the forces of order and of chaos. It first portrays an idealised version of Egypt, a time of plenty. Here we can see typical scenes within an Egyptian temple or funerary context, scenes of the rich bounty of Egypt, all the fruit, the vegetables, the crops, the meat, the fish, all the wealth of the natural environment of Egypt, which was all obviously brought to the land through the good offices of the king, the bringer of all bounty, the intermediary with the gods. But also this causeway contained something rather more disturbing, evidence that dark forces were at work. Further on down the causeway emerged a counterpart image, the flip side of bounty. An image so unusual, it's now displayed in Saqqara's museum, and it really is one of ancient Egypt's most haunting and revealing works of art. Here we see these dark forces at work. What we have are two rows of emaciated victims of famine. These poor people, they're weak with hunger, they're falling down, they're suffering. And this is basically ancient Egypt coming face to face with reality, because these are believed to be the Bedouins who inhabited the desert fringes of Egypt. So it's as if this kind of idea of suffering, the forces of chaos, are on the periphery of Egypt, but they're getting ever closer to the Nile Valley. Egypt is starting to waken up to the fact that chaos isn't all that far away. This is ancient Egypt beginning to suffer. Such gritty realism had rarely been portrayed before. Chaos depicted as the suffering of real people. This isn't happening in some esoteric realm of the gods, where chaos is sort of portrayed as some sort of disparate magical force, very detached from reality. This is reality. Through such realistic images, the Egyptians were expressing their fears to the gods, appealing to them to keep these forces of chaos at bay. But instead, the starving famine victims would turn out to be a chilling omen. Up until now, Egypt's prosperity had flowed from its one source of water, the River Nile, whose annual floods enriched the soil, allowing life and agriculture to flourish. This natural abundance was the very bedrock on which Egypt and its perpetual world order was able to thrive. But this lifeblood was about to run dry. Evidence shows that at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the Nile flood levels fell dramatically. As the very thing that brought them life began to diminish, the Egyptians believed that their gods had begun to abandon them. And for the next century, the ancient texts talk of suffering, starvation, and even cannibalism. Traditionally, Egyptian society had been built on the belief in the divine power of its kings. Without this belief, the Pyramid Age would never have been possible. But now, in its time of need, Egypt's king seemed increasingly powerless in the face of such natural disaster. And this would come to a head with a ruler who was well past his prime. Claimed to have lived for 100 years, he was Egypt's longest-lived monarch, King Pepi II. And this space was once a ceremonial running track, the type of place where Pepi would have to display his physical prowess to prove himself to his people. Now, when any pharaoh had celebrated 30 years' reign, they had to perform the Jubilee ceremonies, and this involved running the ceremonial Jubilee race, 4 times round this circuit as King of the North, 4 times round the circuit as King of the South. It was the ultimate public display of their fitness to rule and their strength. It really showed who was in charge of Egypt. But that's where Pepi's advancing age would eventually let him down. Of course, when Pharaoh was relatively young and fit, this would have been a great celebration. But in the case of poor Pepe, then in his 90s, it became all too clear that Pharaoh was no living god, and this really undermined the whole concept of what it was to be a pharaoh. Clearly as mortal as his subjects, any natural disaster must have seemed the fault of this less than superhuman king. And this combination of a weakening pharaoh and failing harvests led to rapid decline.